It was a sound like a distant, fast-approaching subway train, or perhaps the low, grinding thunder of a sudden storm. But this was Boston's North End, and the clock had just ticked past noon on January 15th, 1919. The day was strangely warm, an aberration in the iron grip of a New England winter, and the air was thick, not with snow, but with an almost suffocating, cloying sweetness. Then came the true sound, an earth-shattering boom, followed by the roar of an unimaginable wave. Forget Krakatoa, forget the biblical plagues. In the heart of one of America's most historic cities, a tsunami was born. It was 25 feet high, it was moving at 35 miles per hour, and it was made entirely of molasses. This is the true story of the Great Molasses Flood, a disaster so bizarre it sounds like fiction, yet so deadly it crushed steel, leveled buildings, and drowned 24 people in sticky, dark syrup. It wasn't an act of God, it was a pure, cold-blooded act of industrial negligence, a tragedy that would expose the dark heart of American capitalism and establish the legal precedent for corporate accountability that protects every citizen today. Part 1. The Colossus and the Compromise. The fuel of a global war. To understand the sheer scale of the disaster, one must first understand the purpose of the sweet, dark liquid. Molasses in 1919 was not just a sweetener for cookies or baked beans, it was a strategic industrial commodity. The vast majority of it was shipped to distilleries to be fermented into industrial-grade alcohol, or ethanol. During World War I, this ethanol was a vital component in the production of smokeless gunpowder and other munitions. The war machine, even after the armistice of November 1918, still had a voracious appetite. The Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of the massive United States Industrial Alcohol Company, was a major player in this supply chain. To handle the volume, they erected a colossal storage tank in 1915 on Commercial Street, right on the Boston waterfront, directly across from Copp's Hill. The sheer size of the tank was terrifyingly impressive. 50 feet tall, roughly 5 stories, 90 feet in diameter, and designed to hold up to 2.5 million gallons of molasses. It stood like a dark, rivet-studded colossus looming over the densely populated North End, Boston's oldest neighborhood, primarily inhabited by recent Italian immigrants and the working poor who toiled on the docks. The warning signs of sweet corrosion. The USIA built the tank fast and cheap. It was a typical rush job of the Gilded Age industrial philosophy: maximize profit, minimize overhead, ignore safety. The builders, in a hurry to meet wartime demand, cut corners on every structural detail. The steel plates used were thinner than required by the original design. The rivets, the metal fasteners holding the entire thing together, were insufficient in both quantity and quality. The tank was never properly pressure tested with water, as was standard practice. Instead, it was filled immediately with the heavy, viscous molasses. From the day it was filled, the tank began to cry out. It leaked. Residents of the North End soon grew accustomed to the sight of molasses oozing from the tank seams, pooling at its base, and staining the surrounding dock. Children, ever drawn to free sugar, would often collect the sticky streams. Locals called it the weepin' tank. The complaints were immediate and widespread. Dock workers reported hearing the tank groan and rumble, particularly when a new shipment arrived and it was filled close to capacity. One dock boss, James O'Brien, testified that he raised concerns to the Purity Distilling management, only to be told to mind his own business. The company's final contemptuous act of structural contempt was to paint the tank a dark brown color, not to repair the leaks, but to simply disguise the oozing syrup. The stage was set not for an accident, but for an inevitability. The unseasonable January day. The day of the disaster was defined by a bizarre fluctuation in temperature. January in Boston is usually a deep freeze, but on January 14th, a fresh shipment of molasses arrived from the Caribbean where the syrup had been heated to decrease its viscosity for transfer. This new warm molasses, estimated at about 2.3 million gallons, was pumped into the structurally compromised tank. Overnight, the Boston air temperature had been well below freezing, but by midday on Wednesday, January 15, 1919, the temperature spiked dramatically, climbing from 2 degrees Fahrenheit to a balmy 40 degrees. This rapid 38-degree temperature change was the final structural killer. The steel tank, already weakened by the thin plates and compromised rivets, was undergoing rapid thermal expansion. The sheer internal pressure, the weight of 13,000 short tons of molasses, combined with the expansion and the heavy vibration from a nearby elevated train line, proved too much. At approximately 12:30 p.m., with the sun high and workers heading out for their lunch break, the tank reached its breaking point. Part 2. The Sticky Tsunami. The eruption. The sound of the rupture was not a simple tear. It was an explosion. The steel plates and iron rivets did not merely separate, they flew outward like shrapnel. Witnesses reported the sound as a deafening cannon shot, followed immediately by the whoosh of air as the massive volume of molasses was violently released. The release of 2.3 million gallons of highly dense liquid created an instant pressure wave that was fundamentally different from a water flood. Molasses is about 40% denser than water. This density, combined with the rapid release of potential energy, created a literal tidal wave that surged through the narrow streets of the North End. The wave's force and speed. Height, estimated at 25 feet at its peak, towering over the heads of the people below. Speed, traveling at a shocking 35 miles per hour, faster than a horse-drawn cart and nearly as fast as the early automobiles on the road. Mass, 14,000 tons of syrup, functioning as a liquid wrecking ball. Destruction on Commercial Street. The initial impact was unimaginable. The molasses hit the area directly surrounding the tank, Commercial Street, Keeney Square, and North End Park with the force of a train wreck. Crushed buildings. The wave instantly demolished the Purity Distilling Company's main building and completely swept the foundation out from under the Boston Fire Department's Fire Station 31, a multi-story brick building. Fireman George Leahy was trapped in the collapse, drowning in the basement as the molasses poured in. Elevated train. The wave slammed into the steel trestle of the Boston Elevated Railway Line's Atlantic Avenue line. It was powerful enough to rip steel girders from the ground and temporarily derail a train carriage, which miraculously did not plummet to the street below. Human victims. Pedestrians were simply snatched up and carried along. The victims were not just pushed, they were crushed by the force, then submerged and suffocated. The initial hot temperature of the molasses may have also caused burns before the liquid began to cool. One witness, a railway worker named Antonio Girelli, described it as a dark brown treacle-like tidal wave, while another said it looked like a solid brown wall moving relentlessly. The most poignant and enduring image of the disaster was the fate of the horses. They were a crucial part of the city's commerce, pulling carts and wagons. Caught by the sticky flood, they struggled furiously, but the more they thrashed, the deeper they were entombed in the dense syrup. Dozens of horses died a gruesome death, stuck to the cobblestones like flies on flypaper. The entire destructive phase, the rupture, the surge, and the initial wave of destruction was over in less than 90 seconds. The silence that followed was only broken by the horrifying, gurgling sound of the massive volume of molasses slowly spreading and settling. Part 3. The Rescue in Treacle. The Viscosity Trap. The tragedy did not end when the wave stopped moving. As the molasses began to cool in the January air, it rapidly increased its viscosity. It became thicker, heavier, and more solid. The victims who were not killed instantly by the impact were now trapped, sealed into a sticky, syrupy tomb. The disaster site resembled a battlefield. The streets were submerged waist-deep in a brown, bubbling mess. Debris, shattered wood, twisted steel, fragments of carts and bodies was scattered throughout the thick, sucking liquid. Help arrived quickly, but was severely hampered. Sailors from the nearby USS Nantucket training ship were among the first responders, joined by police, firefighters, and hundreds of local volunteers. The immediate problem was mobility. Walking in the molasses was nearly impossible. Rescuers had to lay long planks and ladders across the surface of the syrup and crawl out to where the muffled cries for help could be heard. Extraction. Pulling people out was a brutal, physically demanding task. The molasses clung to everything, creating a powerful suction. Victims had to be physically dragged out, often losing clothing and suffering severe trauma. Identification. The bodies of the dead were covered in a thick, insulating glaze of molasses, making identification extremely difficult. Many victims died from suffocation or from being crushed by the debris the molasses carried. Medical care. The injured, estimated at 150 people, were taken to local hospitals, where doctors and nurses were forced to scrape and wash the dense syrup out of noses, mouths, and lungs before they could even treat broken bones and internal injuries. The final death toll was 21 people, including two 10-year-old boys who were playing nearby, and an unknown number of animals. The smelling city and the cleanup. The cleanup was a monumental task that lasted for weeks. Fire crews attempted to wash the streets with fire hoses, but the molasses was so thick that water alone was useless. They eventually had to resort to using salt water pumped directly from Boston Harbor, which helped to break down the syrup. For months, the North End was a surreal landscape of molasses-coated wreckage. The smell, a heavy, fermenting sweetness, was inescapable. The cleanup water, loaded with molasses, drained into the harbor, staining the water dark brown for weeks. Even the soil itself was saturated. For decades afterward, long after the physical mess was gone, residents of the North End claimed that on a hot summer day, they could still smell the faint, ghostly scent of fermenting molasses rising from the ground. Part 4. The Courtroom and Corporate Guilt. The Blame Game. The city was in shock. A preventable industrial disaster had devastated a working-class neighborhood. The subsequent investigation and legal battle became one of the most significant moments in American corporate law history. The company, USIA, immediately began a campaign to deflect blame. Their official defense was outrageous. They claimed the tank had been blown up by anarchists or Bolsheviks acting in an anti-capitalist conspiracy. This was 1919, a time of the Red Scare, and USIA attempted to exploit the nation's political paranoia to escape liability. They argued that only a bomb could have ruptured a tank that, in their view, was structurally sound. The victims and their families, 114 separate plaintiffs, were represented in a landmark legal battle against the powerful corporation. The sheer weight of the litigation and the bizarre nature of the accident necessitated the appointment of an independent auditor, Colonel Hugh W. Ogden, who was tasked with hearing all evidence and determining fault. The birth of modern engineering standards.
The most crucial testimony came from Professor Charles Spofford, head of civil engineering at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Spofford performed meticulous scientific analysis that fundamentally dismantled USIA's defense. Forensic engineering. Spofford collected the shattered pieces of the steel tank and rivets. He tested the tensile strength of the metal and measured the thickness of the plates. His findings were conclusive. The steel plates were thinner than the standards of the day dictated, and the rivets were too few and too weak to handle the immense pressure. He calculated that the internal pressure generated by the 2.3 million gallons of molasses was 31,000 pounds per square inch on the tank walls, nearly double the maximum safe stress level. The failure of testing. Spofford proved that the tank was structurally doomed from the start, and that USIA's refusal to properly test it and heed the warnings of the local community was the direct criminal cause of the disaster. After 3 years of agonizing hearings, Colonel Ogden's final ruling was a victory for public safety. He dismissed USIA's anarchist claims and declared that the company was entirely responsible for the collapse due to faulty construction and gross negligence. The aftermath. A precedent for America. USIA was forced to pay damages, ultimately settling for a figure in today's money equivalent to several $1 million, an enormous sum for the era. The Great Molasses Flood was more than just a peculiar tragedy. It was a watershed moment for American industrial regulation. The legal fallout from the case led directly to the establishment of new building codes and regulations in Boston and eventually across the United States. It mandated that engineers and architects must sign and seal their plans, requiring professional licensing and accountability for structural safety. Furthermore, it established a legal precedent that held corporations accountable for the safety of their structures and for the harm they inflicted on surrounding communities, marking one of the earliest successful large-scale class action lawsuits in American history. The sweet dark tide that rushed through the North End killed 21 people, but in the process, it forced America to create the foundational safety standards that protect its workers and communities to this day. It remains a grim, sticky testament to the axiom that, in the face of human life, profit is never the primary measure of worth.